Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to drift along the slow-moving waterways of Victorian England, where families spent their entire lives aboard narrow boats, no wider than 7 feet. We'll explore what it was like to wake up, work, eat, and sleep on these floating homes, traveling the canal system day after day, season after season. Before we begin our journey, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull up your blanket. Maybe take a slow, deep breath. If you enjoy these sorts of stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you relax. And if you'd like, leave a comment about where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us on these quiet historical journeys. Now then, let's ease into tonight's story together. When we think of Victorian England, we often picture cobblestone streets, gas lamps, and the Industrial Revolution churning away in smoky factories. But there was another world, quieter and slower, that existed alongside all that noise and bustle. It was the world of the canals, narrow ribbons of water that connected cities and towns across the country, carrying coal pottery, grain, and textiles from place to place. And living on these canals, working them day in and day out, were the boat families. Entire households, mothers, fathers, children, sometimes grandparents, all squeezed into narrow boats that measured around 70 feet long, but only 6.5 to 7 feet wide. These weren't pleasure cruises or weekend getaways. This was home. This was work. This was life. So tonight, let's step aboard one of these narrow boats and see what daily life was really like for the families who called the canals home. Let's start with the boat itself, because understanding the space is essential to understanding the life. A typical narrow boat, or narrowboat, as they came to be called, was built specifically for Britain's canal system. The canals had been dug with locks of a standard width, 7 feet, which meant the boats had to be narrow enough to fit through. So the boats were built long and slim, 70 feet of length, but only about 6.5 feet of width at the widest point. Imagine a floating hallway. That's essentially what you were living and working in. The boat was divided into sections. At the very front, the bow, you had the cargo hold. This was the main body of the boat, and it was where everything being transported was loaded. Coal, pottery, bricks, grain, textiles, whatever the job called for. It was a large, open space, and when it was full, it was stacked carefully to balance the weight and maximize capacity. When empty, it was just a hollow wooden cavern, echoing with every footstep. Behind the cargo hold, separated by a bulkhead, was the cabin. This is where the family lived. And when I say cabin, I mean a space that was typically no more than 9 to 10 feet long and about 6 feet wide. In this tiny area, you had everything a family needed to live. A bed, a stove, storage for clothes and food, maybe a small table that folded down. Sometimes there was a crossbed, a bed that stretched across the width of the boat, and sometimes there were side bunks. Either way, there wasn't much room. If you had children, they slept wherever space could be found. Small children might sleep in cupboard beds, literally beds built into cupboards or under benches. Older children might sleep in the cargo hold when it wasn't completely full, nestled among the sacks or crates. Privacy was not a thing. Space was not a thing. You learned to make do. The cabin was usually beautifully decorated, though. Despite the cramped quarters, or perhaps because of them, boat families took great pride in painting and ornamenting their living space. The walls were often covered in decorative paintwork. Roses, castles, diamonds, intricate scrollwork in bright reds, greens, blues, and yellows. Every surface that could be painted was painted. Water cans, buckets, tool handles, door, all of it covered in what became known as roses and castles decoration. It was a distinctive style, unique to the canal boats, and it turned these tiny cramped cabins into jewel boxes of color and pattern. Why did they do this? Partly pride, partly tradition. When your entire world is 7 feet wide and you spend months at a time in the same small space, making it beautiful matters. It was a way of claiming the space, of saying, this is ours, this is home. And in a life where you were constantly moving, constantly working, having that sense of home, however small, was important. Behind the cabin, at the very rear of the boat, was the stern deck. This was an open area, maybe 6 or 7 feet long, where the tiller was located. The tiller was the long wooden handle used to steer the boat. It was simple. Push it left, the boat goes right. Push it right, the boat goes left. No fancy controls, no wheel. Just a long pole connected to the rudder and your own strength and attention. Steering a narrow boat was surprisingly demanding. The boats were heavy. When fully loaded, they could weigh over 20 tons, and the water they moved through was often shallow, sometimes just a few feet deep. The boat sat low in the water, and it moved slowly, maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour when being towed by a horse, a bit faster with a motor in later years. It required constant small adjustments to keep the boat centered in the canal, to avoid scraping the sides, to navigate the curves and bends. You couldn't just set a course and relax. You had to be present, alert, adjusting constantly. In good weather, steering was pleasant enough. You were out in the open air, watching the countryside roll past at a walking pace. But in bad weather, rain, sleet, snow, bitter wind, steering became an ordeal. There was no shelter on the stern deck. You were exposed to everything. Ice would form on the tiller, your hands would go numb. Your clothes would soak through, and you couldn't stop because the schedule had to be kept, the cargo had to be delivered, the family had to eat. Let's pause here for a moment. Just imagine it. You're standing at the back of a long, narrow boat. The tiller is cold under your hands. Rain is coming down steadily, soaking into your coat. The horse up ahead, towing the boat along the towpath, is plodding steadily forward, head down, ears back against the weather. The canal stretches out in front of you, grey and flat, disappearing into the mist. There's no one else around, just you, the boat, the water, and the slow, steady rhythm of forward movement. This was the daily reality for canal families. Not dramatic, not exciting, just steady, persistent work in a small, confined space, day after day, mile after mile. So what did a typical day look like for a canal boat family? Let's start with waking up. Mornings began early, often before dawn, especially in summer when the days were long and there was work to be done. The cabin would still be dark, the air cool. You'd wake to the sound of water lapping against the hull, maybe the distant call of a bird from the towpath. The bed was warm. You'd been sleeping under heavy blankets, possibly several of you crammed together for warmth, but the cabin itself would be cold. The first task was getting the stove going. The stove was the heart of the cabin, a small cast iron affair that served as both heater and cooking surface. It was usually placed in the center of the cabin or toward one end, with a stovepipe leading up through the roof. Getting it lit required kindling, coal or wood, and patience. You'd stuff crumpled newspaper or dry grass into the firebox, add thin pieces of wood, then carefully place a few lumps of coal on top. Strike a match. Wait. Blow gently to encourage the flame. Wait some more. Once the fire caught, the cabin would begin to warm slowly. You'd put a kettle on for tea. Tea was essential, a constant companion. And start thinking about breakfast. Breakfast was usually simple. Bread, perhaps with butter or dripping if you had it. Maybe porridge, made with water or milk, if you were lucky enough to have fresh milk. Sometimes there was bacon, fried in a pan on the stove, the smell filling the tiny cabin. While one adult was managing the stove and preparing food, the other would be getting ready to start the boat moving. If you had a horse, this meant going ashore to fetch it from wherever it had been stabled overnight, usually a small stable near the canal, or sometimes just tied up on the towpath, and getting it harnessed to the tow line. The tow line was a long rope that ran from the horse to the front of the boat. The horse would walk along the towpath, pulling the boat through the water behind it. Horses were incredibly valuable. A good boat horse was strong, steady, and intelligent. It knew the routes, knew when to speed up or slow down, knew how to navigate around obstacles on the towpath. Some horses worked for years with the same family, becoming almost like members of the household. They were fed well, hay, oats, whatever could be afforded, and cared for carefully. A lame or sick horse could mean the end of a family's livelihood. Once the horse was harnessed and ready, the boat would begin to move, slowly, very slowly. A walking pace, basically. 2 or 3 miles per hour. It sounds painfully slow by modern standards, but this was normal. This was the speed of life on the canals. There was no rushing. There was no hurry. You moved at the pace of the horse, and the horse moved at the pace it could sustain for hours on end. Someone had to walk with the horse. Usually this was one of the adults, or an older child. You walked beside the horse, keeping an eye on it, making sure it didn't wander off the towpath or stop unexpectedly. Sometimes you'd talk to the horse, quiet words of encouragement. Sometimes you'd just walk in silence, listening to the steady clop of hooves on dirt, the creak of the harness, the gentle slosh of water against the boat's hull. Walking the towpath was its own experience, or the path was usually narrow, just wide enough for a person and a horse, sometimes less. It was muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry. There were puddles, ruts, overgrown sections where brambles grabbed at your legs. There were bridges to pass under, some so low you had to duck. There were other boats coming the other way, and when two boats met, you had to coordinate. One horse would stop and be led around the tow line of the other boat, or the lines would be carefully lifted and passed over or under each other. It required communication, cooperation, sometimes shouting across the water. Meanwhile, back on the boat, the person steering had their own concerns. The canal wasn't always straight. There were curves, bends, junctions where one canal met another. There were areas where the water was shallow or where debris had collected, and you had to be careful not to run aground. There were bridges to navigate under, locks to prepare for. Locks were a special challenge. A lock is essentially a water elevator, a section of the canal enclosed by two sets of gates, where the water level could be raised or lowered to move boats from one elevation to another. England's canal system had thousands of locks, and navigating them was a routine but labor-intensive process. Here's how it worked. You'd approach a lock, and someone would have to go ahead to prepare it. This usually meant opening or closing the gate paddles, sluices that controlled the flow of water in and out of the lock chamber. If you were going uphill, you'd fill the lock by opening the upper paddles, letting water flow in from the higher level. If you were going downhill, you'd empty the lock by opening the lower paddles, draining water out to the lower level. Once the water in the lock was at the same level as the section of canal you were on, you could open the gates and bring the boat in. Then you'd close the gates behind you, open the opposite paddles, and wait while the water level changed. It could take 10 or 15 minutes, depending on the size of the lock. You'd just stand there, watching the water rise or fall, feeling the boat settle or lift. Then the gates at the other end would be opened, and you'd steer the boat out into the next section of canal. This happened over and over, all day long. Some flights of locks had 10, 15, even 20 locks in a row, tall, lifting boats up or down a hillside. It was exhausting. Your arms ached from working the paddles. Your back ached from leaning against the heavy wooden gates to push them open or shut. But it was part of the job. No locks, no travel. No travel, no work. Between locks, during the long stretches of flat canal, life settled into a rhythm. The boat moved forward steadily. The person steering watched the water, made small adjustments, kept the boat centered. The person walking with the horse kept pace, step after step, mile after mile. Sometimes they'd pass other boats, exchange a few words of greeting, ask about conditions ahead. Sometimes they'd pass through small villages, see children playing by the water, hear the sounds of daily life, a blacksmith's hammer, a dog barking, someone calling out. Lunch was usually eaten on the move. You didn't stop unless you absolutely had to. Stopping meant lost time, and lost time meant lost money. So lunch was simple, portable, more bread, perhaps some cheese, cold leftover bacon from breakfast. You ate standing up, or sitting on the edge of the cabin, or while steering. The kettle was always on, so there was always tea. Afternoons were more of the same. Mile after mile, lock after lock. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened. Your body settled into the rhythm of the work. The repetitive motion of steering, or walking, or cranking paddles. Your mind wandered. You thought about the cargo, the delivery schedule, the money you'd earn. You thought about repairs the boat needed, supplies you'd have to buy at the next town. You thought about very little sometimes. You just moved. Now let's talk about the children. Because childhood on a canal boat was unlike childhood almost anywhere else. Canal boat children grew up in that tiny cabin, in that narrow floating world. From the moment they could walk, they were part of the work. There was no separation between family life and working life. The boat was both home and workplace, and everyone contributed. Very young children, babies and toddlers, were kept in the cabin mostly. It was safer there, less risk of falling into the water. The cabin was child-proofed as much as possible. Though in such a small space, dangers were everywhere. The stove was hot. The doorways were low and narrow. Storage cupboards had sharp corners. Mothers developed an almost supernatural awareness of where their children were at every moment, what they were touching, what they might be about to do. Toddlers learned to walk on a moving surface. The boat rocked gently as it moved through the water, and children learned to compensate, to balance, to move with the motion. They played in the tiny cabin with whatever toys could be found or made, carved wooden animals, rag dolls, bits of rope, empty tins. There wasn't room for much else. As children got a bit older, say 5 or 6, they started to help with simple tasks. They might fetch water from the canal using a bucket. They might help stir porridge on the stove. They might be sent to walk with the horse for short stretches, giving an adult a break. They learned by the watching, by doing, by being corrected when they made mistakes. Education was a complicated matter. Legally, children were supposed to attend school, but enforcement was spotty, especially for boat children. Schools were built on land, in towns and villages, and boat families were always moving. You might tie up near a town for a day or two while loading or unloading cargo, and during that time, children might attend a local school. But then the boat would move on, and the children would leave that school behind, possibly never to return. Some children received very little formal education. They could read and write just enough to manage basic tasks, reading signs, writing delivery notes, but not much more. Others, particularly in families that made regular routes and tied up in the same places repeatedly, managed to attend school more consistently. There were also canal schools in some areas, special schools set up specifically for boat children, located near major wharfs or junctions where boats congregated. But for many children, the real education was practical. They learned to steer a boat by the time they were 10 or 11. They learned to manage a horse, to work the locks, to splice rope, to paint and maintain the boat. They learned to read the water, where it was deep, where it was shallow, where currents or wind might cause problems. They learned to read the weather, the sky, the feel of the air. This was the knowledge that mattered, the knowledge that would allow them to make a living on the canals when they grew up. And many of them did grow up to work the canals. It was a family tradition, passed down through generations. You were born on a boat, you grew up on a boat, you married someone from another boat family, and you worked the canals your whole life. It was insular. It was self-contained. Boat people tended to marry other boat people, live among boat people, socialize with boat people. Outsiders, land folk, were viewed with a certain amount of suspicion or distance. There was a culture, a whole way of being that was specific to the canal families. They had their own dialect, their own slang, their own social customs. They had a reputation too. Landfolk often viewed boat people as rough, uneducated, perhaps not quite respectable. There were stereotypes that boat people were dirty, that their children ran wild, that they were dishonest or untrustworthy. Like most stereotypes, these were unfair and often untrue, but they persisted. The truth was more complicated. Yes, life on the boats was hard, and cleanliness was a challenge when your water source was the canal and your living space was 7 feet wide. But most boat families took pride in their appearance and their homes. Those beautifully painted cabins were scrubbed and polished. Clothes were washed whenever possible and hung to dry on lines strung along the boat. Children were kept as clean as circumstances allowed. But the prejudice was real, and it affected the children. They were sometimes excluded from land-based social activities. They were sometimes teased or bullied by land children. They occupied a sort of in-between space, not quite part of the settled world, not quite nomadic, just constantly moving through. For children, this meant a childhood that was both limited and expansive. Limited in terms of space and material comforts. No bedroom of your own, no yard to play in, no staying in one place long enough to form deep friendships with other children. But expansive in terms of freedom and experience. You traveled the country. You saw different towns, different landscapes. You had responsibilities, real work from a young age. You learned self-reliance. There was also a closeness, a family cohesion that came from living in such tight quarters. You were never alone. You were always with your family. You knew each other's rhythms, moods, habits. You learned to get along, to cooperate, to solve problems together. You had to. There was no storming off to your room when you were angry. There was no room to storm off to. Nighttime for children on the boats was cozy in a way that's hard to describe. After a long day of work, with the boat tied up for the night, the cabin would be warm from the stove. The lamps would be lit, small oil lamps, casting a soft, flickering glow. The family would gather in that tiny space, maybe eating a simple dinner, maybe just sitting together. Children would be tucked into their sleeping spots, the crossbed, the cupboard beds, a pile of blankets in the cargo hold. And as they drifted off to sleep, they'd hear the familiar sounds, water lapping against the hull, the creak of wood settling. Perhaps the distant sound of another boat passing, or voices from the towpath, or the soft snort of the horse tethered nearby. It was a life of constant motion, but also constant routine. The same tasks, the same rhythms, day after day. For children, this was normal. This was just how life was. The boat, the canal, the endless miles of water. This was the world. Let's turn our attention now to food. Because feeding a family in a space the size of a walk-in closet required creativity and careful planning. The stove, as I mentioned earlier, was the heart of the cabin. It was small, with maybe 1 or 2 cooking surfaces and a small oven. Fuel was usually coal, which was abundant on the canals, since so many boats carried coal as cargo. If your boat was carrying coal, you'd help yourself to what you needed. If not, you'd buy it cheaply at wharfs or from other boats. The stove was always on, or nearly always, because it served 2 purposes: cooking and heating. In winter, you needed the heat. The cabin would be freezing otherwise. In summer, the stove made the cabin unbearably hot, but you still needed it to cook. So you learned to manage it, banking the fire low when you didn't need much heat, building it up when you were cooking or when the temperature dropped. Storage for food was limited. There was no refrigeration, obviously. This was the Victorian era, and even on land refrigeration was rare. On a boat, it was non-existent. So everything had to be either non-perishable or used quickly or preserved in some way. Dried goods were staples. Flour, tea, sugar, salt, dried beans, rice. These could be stored for weeks or months in tins or sacks, tucked into cupboards or under benches. You bought these in bulk when you could, at market towns along the route. Fresh food was trickier. Bread would go stale after a few days, so you either baked your own on the stove, a time-consuming process, or you bought fresh bread frequently when passing through towns. Vegetables, potatoes, onions, carrots would keep for a while if stored in a cool, dark place. Some boats had small storage areas where vegetables could be kept relatively cool. Meat was expensive and hard to keep fresh, so it wasn't eaten often. When you did have meat, it was usually bacon or salt pork, both preserved with salt, which meant they'd keep for weeks. You'd slice off what you needed and fry it in a pan. The fat would be saved and used for cooking other things, because nothing was wasted. Sometimes you'd buy fresh meat from a butcher in town, but you'd cook it and eat it that day or the next, before it spoiled. In warmer months, meat spoiled quickly, and food poisoning was a real risk. You learned to smell food, to check it carefully, to err on the side of caution. Fish was more common than meat and easier to come by. The canals had fish, pike, perch, roach, and if you had a bit of time, you could catch them. A simple rod and line, some bait, and patience. Fresh fish fried in a pan was a welcome change from the usual diet. Milk was a luxury. It spoiled quickly, so you could only have it if you passed a farm and bought it fresh. Condensed milk, sweetened and canned, became popular in the late Victorian era and was a godsend for boat families. It didn't spoil, and you could add it to tea or use it in cooking. Eggs were more reliable. They'd keep for a week or two if stored carefully, and they were versatile. Fried, boiled, scrambled, added to batter or dough. If you passed a farm, you'd buy eggs directly from the farmer, maybe a dozen at a time. Meals were simple and repetitive. Breakfast, as I mentioned, was often porridge or bread. Dinner, the midday meal, might be bread and cheese, or leftover bacon, or a simple stew if you had vegetables and time to let it simmer on the stove. Tea, the evening meal, was the main meal of the day, eaten after the boat was tied up for the night. This might be a hot stew or soup, or fried fish, or bacon and potatoes, or bread and dripping. Stews were ideal because you could put everything in one pot and let it cook slowly on the stove while you worked. Potatoes, onions, maybe a bit of meat or bacon, water, salt, and whatever else you had on hand. Let it simmer for an hour or two, stirring occasionally. By evening, you'd have a hot, filling meal. Tea, the drink, was consumed constantly, gallons of it. Strong black tea, sweetened with sugar if you could afford it, maybe with a splash of milk if you had it. The kettle was always on, always ready. Tea was comfort, warmth, routine. It was a break in the day. It was something to offer when another boater stopped by. It was part of the culture. Water for drinking and cooking came from the canal usually. You'd scoop it up in a bucket. It wasn't clean by modern standards. Canals were full of dirt, algae, runoff from farms and factories. But people didn't know about bacteria the way we do now. They just knew to boil water for tea or cooking, which killed most of the harmful things in it. Drinking water straight from the canal was less common, but it happened. Some boats had rain barrels, containers set out to catch rainwater, which was cleaner than canal water. Rainwater was preferred for drinking if you had it, but you couldn't always rely on it, especially in dry weather. Washing dishes was done with canal water, heated on the stove. You'd wash in a basin or bucket, then rinse, then dry. The dirty water was tossed back into the canal. Everything went into the canal, eventually: dishwater, food scraps, human waste. The canal was both resource and disposal system. Cooking in such a small space required organization. Every pot, pan, and utensil had its place. You couldn't leave things out. There was no room. Everything had to be washed and put away immediately. The work surface was tiny, maybe a small shelf or the top of a storage box. You learned to be efficient, to work in stages, to make do with what you had. And yet, despite the limitations, meals were important. They were one of the few times the family would all be together, sitting down, not working. Even if you were eating simple food from tin plates in a cramped cabin, it was a moment of rest, of connection. You'd talk about the day, the route ahead, the cargo, repairs that needed doing. Or you'd eat in comfortable silence, too tired for talk, just grateful for the food and the warmth and the brief pause in the work. Life on the canals changed with the seasons. Each season brought its own challenges, its own rhythms, its own particular discomforts and pleasures. Spring was renewal. The days got longer. The air got warmer. The countryside along the canals came alive. Trees budding, flowers blooming, birds nesting in the hedgerows. The water itself seemed to wake up, teeming with life. Ducks and moorhen appeared, building nests along the banks. Fish became more active, easier to catch. For boat families, spring meant the return of longer working days. You could travel more hours because there was more daylight. The work was easier too. The cold that had made everything harder in winter was gone. Your hands didn't go numb. Your clothes didn't soak through with icy rain. The horse seemed livelier, more willing. But spring also meant mud. The towpaths, frozen hard in winter, thawed into thick, sucking mud. Walking became treacherous. Horses slipped and struggled. You'd come back to the boat at the end of the day covered in mud up to your knees, your boots heavy with it. And spring meant rain. Lots of rain. England is a rainy place, and spring brought showers that could last for days. The canal would rise, sometimes flooding over its banks. Locks would overflow. The water would be murky, full of runoff from fields and roads. Everything would be damp. Your clothes, your bedding, the wooden walls of the cabin. Mold and mildew were constant battles. Summer was the best season generally. Long days meant long working hours, which meant more miles covered, more jobs completed, more money earned. The weather was warm, often hot. You could work in your shirt sleeves. Children could run along the towpath barefoot. You could wash clothes and hang them out to dry on the boat, and they'd actually dry. You could eat outside, sitting on the stern deck in the evening, watching the sun set over the fields. But summer had its challenges too. The heat could be oppressive, especially in the cabin. The small stove, necessary for cooking, turned the cabin into an oven. You'd cook as quickly as possible, then escape outside. Sleeping was difficult on the hottest nights. The cabin was stuffy, airless. You'd leave the doors open, hoping for a breeze, but then you'd be bothered by insects, mosquitoes, midges, flies. The canals themselves could be problematic in summer. Water levels dropped. The shallow sections became shallower. You'd run aground more easily, scraping the bottom of the boat on mud or stones. Sometimes the water would drop so low that certain sections of canal became impassable, and you'd have to wait, idle, for rain to raise the level again. Weeds were another summer problem. The canals would choke with weed growth, thick, stringy masses of plant matter that tangled in the boat's propeller. Once motorboats became common, or wrapped around the rudder, you'd have to stop and clear it, hauling up armfuls of slimy green weed, tossing it onto the bank. Autumn was a season of change. The days shortened, the air cooled, the leaves turned colour, brilliant reds, oranges, yellows, and then fell, carpeting the towpaths and floating on the surface of the water. There was a feeling of preparation, of tightening things up for the winter ahead. Work continued, but with an urgency. You wanted to complete as many jobs as possible before winter made travel difficult. You stocked up on supplies, coal, food, warm clothes. You made repairs to the boat that you'd been putting off. You checked the horses' shoes, bought extra blankets, made sure the stove was in good working order. The weather became unpredictable. Some days were warm and sunny, like summer. Other days were cold and wet, a preview of winter. Fog was common in autumn, thick and grey, settling over the canals in the early morning and late evening. Navigating in fog was nerve-wracking. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. You had to go slowly, listening for the sound of other boats, watching for the dark shapes of bridges or locks emerging from the mist. Winter was the hardest season, without question. The days were short. The sun rose late and set early, leaving only a few hours of good light for travelling. The cold was bitter, especially on the open stern deck, where the person steering had no shelter. Your hands would ache from gripping the cold tiller. Your face would go numb. Ice would form on the metalwork, on the ropes, on the very surface of the water. When the canal froze over completely, all work stopped. You couldn't move a boat through solid ice. The entire canal system would shut down, sometimes for weeks. Boat families would be stuck wherever they happened to be when the freeze hit. If you were lucky, you were near a town where you could buy supplies. If not, you had to make do with whatever you had on board. Being icebound was a strange experience. The constant motion stopped. The boat sat still, locked in place by the ice. The silence was profound. No water lapping, no creaking of ropes or wood. Just cold and stillness. The cabin became your entire world. You couldn't go anywhere. Couldn't do anything but wait. To pass the time, you'd do maintenance work, repair harnesses, paint decorations, splice rope, sharpen tools. You'd cook meals that took longer to prepare, things you didn't have time for during busy seasons. You'd tell stories, play simple games, sleep more than usual. The children would sometimes be allowed to walk on the ice, though it was dangerous. Thin ice could crack and you could fall through into freezing water. Money was a constant worry during winter stoppages. No work meant no income, and supplies still had to be bought. Some families saved money during the busy summer months to tide them over winter. Others went into debt, borrowing from boat owners or merchants, paying it back when work resumed in spring. When the thaw finally came, it was a relief. The ice would crack and break up. The water would flow again. Boats would start moving. The whole canal system would come back to life, and your family would join the movement once again, picking up where you'd left off, settling back into the familiar rhythm of work. Despite spending so much time in motion, traveling from place to place, canal boat families were part of a community. It was a scattered community, spread across hundreds of miles of waterways. But it was real nonetheless. You'd see the same boats over and over, families that worked similar routes, that carried similar cargoes. You'd recognize them from a distance by their painted decorations, by the way they sat in the water by the horse pulling them. You'd exchange greetings as you passed. A wave, a shouted hello, a brief conversation if you were both waiting at a lock. These weren't always deep friendships, but they were connections. You knew each other's names, knew which company they worked for, knew their general route. If someone was having trouble, a sick horse, a mechanical problem, an injury, other boaters would help if they could. There was a sense of shared experience, of understanding what the life was like. At major junctions or wharfs, where boats congregated to load or unload cargo, there was more opportunity for socializing. While waiting your turn at the wharf, you'd tie up alongside other boats. The men might gather on the towpath, smoking pipes, talking about work, about conditions on different sections of Canal, about pay rates and difficult cargo. The women might visit each other's boats, admiring new paintwork, sharing recipes or remedies, talking about children. Children would play together, running along the towpath, playing chase, climbing on moored boats, throwing stones into the water. These were rare opportunities for boat children to interact with other children, and they made the most of it. There were also pubs near the major wharves and junctions. Pubs were social hubs for canal workers. After a long day's work, men would go to the pub for a pint of beer, a hot meal, conversation and companionship. Women sometimes went too, though it was less common. The pub was a place to hear news, to make contacts for future work, to relax. Some pubs were specifically known as canal pubs, places where boat people were welcomed, where the landlord understood their way of life. These places would have stabling for horses, would serve food at odd hours to accommodate the irregular schedules of boat workers, would sometimes allow people to sleep in the barn or stable if the boat was too crowded. There were also mission halls and chapels near some canals, set up specifically to serve boat families. These were run by religious organizations who were concerned about the welfare of canal workers. They offered basic education for children, held Sunday services, sometimes provided meals or medical care. Some boat families attended regularly. Others were suspicious of these do-gooders and stayed away. Holidays and celebrations happened on the boats too. Christmas, even in the middle of winter work, was marked somehow. You'd buy special food if you could afford it. A bit of ham or a chicken, some dried fruit for a pudding, oranges for the children if you were feeling flush. The cabin would be decorated simply, maybe some holly or evergreen branches brought aboard. There'd be small gifts, practical things mostly, like warm socks or a new knife, but treasured nonetheless. Fairs and festivals in towns along the route were opportunities for entertainment. If your timing was right and you could spare a few hours, you'd stop and take the children to see the fair, the travelling performers, the market stalls, the excitement and colour. It was a glimpse into a different world, a reminder that life existed beyond the narrow confines of the canal. Marriages within the canal community were common. Young people met at wharfs or junctions, courted briefly, and married. Weddings were simple affairs. a quick ceremony in a town registry, office, or chapel. Maybe a celebration at a pub with other boat families. Then back to work. Often, a young couple would take over a boat from an older generation, continuing the family business. Births happened on the boats too. When a woman was in labor, the boat would tie up if possible. And a midwife would be called from the nearest town. Sometimes there wasn't time, and babies were born in the tiny cabin with only family members to help. It was dangerous. Childbirth always was in this era, even on land. But boat women didn't have much choice. The work had to continue. Deaths also happened. Accidents were common. Falling into the water, getting caught in ropes or machinery, being kicked by a horse. Illness could strike quickly and be difficult to treat. When someone died, the boat would stop. The body would be taken to the nearest town for burial. There'd be a simple funeral, attended by whoever was in the area at the time. And then life would go on. The boat would move again. The work would continue. This was the nature of canal life, a mixture of isolation and community, of constant movement and deep routine, of hardship and resilience. Now we should talk about what happened to this way of life, because it didn't last forever. The canal system of Britain had its golden age in the early 1800s, before the railways came. Canals were the fastest, most efficient way to move heavy goods across the country. The boat families who worked the canals were essential to the industrial economy. They carried coal to power factories, raw materials to mills, finished goods to markets. The canals were busy, profitable, and the families who worked them could make a decent living. But then came the railways. Starting in the 1830s and 1840s, railway lines began spreading across Britain. Trains were faster than canal boats, much faster. What took a canal boat days or weeks to transport could be done by rail in hours. And trains could go places canals couldn't reach, could operate in weather that would stop canal traffic. The competition was devastating for the canal companies. Traffic declined. Rates for carrying goods dropped as companies tried to compete with the railways. Boat families found themselves working longer hours for less pay. Some canal routes became unprofitable and were abandoned. Sections of canal fell into disrepair. Families who had worked the canals for generations had to adapt. Some left the boats entirely, moving onto land, finding work in factories or on farms. It was a difficult transition, learning to live in one place, adapting to different work rhythms, entering a society that had often viewed them with suspicion. Others stayed on the boats, but had to change how they worked. They took any cargo they could get, no matter how poorly paid. They worked longer routes, traveled in worse conditions, accepted lower standards of living just to survive. The introduction of motorboats in the early 1900s changed things again. Motor-powered boats were faster than horse-drawn boats, and they didn't require the expense of keeping a horse. But motors were expensive, and not everyone could afford them. The canal system became divided between families with motorboats, who could work more efficiently, and those still using horsepower, who struggled to compete. Through all this, the families adapted as best they could. The children who grew up on boats in the early 1900s saw their way of life slowly disappearing. Some left for cities, seeking work in the new industrial economy. Some joined the military during the World Wars and found that life in the army or navy, for all its hardships, offered things they'd never had before. Regular pay, education, healthcare, a chance to see the world beyond the canals. World War II brought a brief resurgence for the canals. With railways bombed and fuel rationed, the canals became strategically important again. Boats carried coal, food, and war materials. The government even recruited women, called idle women from the initials IW for inland waterways, to work the boats when men were away fighting. These were mostly middle and upper class women, volunteers seeking to contribute to the war effort, and their experiences brought new attention to the conditions canal families had endured for generations. But after the war, the decline continued. More roads were built. Trucks became the primary way to move goods. By the 50s and 60s, working boats on the canals were becoming rare. The families who remained were aging, their children having chosen different lives. The beautiful painted boats were becoming curiosities, relics of a disappearing world. Today, the canals of Britain are still there, mostly preserved as recreational waterways. You can rent a narrow boat and cruise the canals for a holiday. You'll pass through the same locks, under the same bridges, through the same stretches of countryside that working families traveled for over a century. The boats look similar, long and narrow, painted with traditional roses and castles designs. But they are floating hotels now, equipped with modern conveniences, used for leisure rather than labor. A few of the old working boats have been preserved in museums. You can step inside and see how cramped the cabins were, how beautifully decorated, how every inch of space was used. You can look at photographs of the families, weathered faces, worn hands, the children in too small clothes, standing on the stern deck with the tiller behind them. You can try to imagine what it was like, but you can't really know. That world is gone. The constant motion, the rhythm of the work, the particular combination of hardship and freedom, isolation and community, all of it has passed into history. Let's end our journey by imagining one particular day. An ordinary day, unremarkable. The kind of day that happened thousands of times for thousands of families. Let's make it a spring day in, say, 1880. The canal system is still busy. The railways are competing, but there's still plenty of work for boat families. The morning starts before dawn. The cabin is cold. You wake to the sound of rain on the cabin roof, steady and soft. You lie there for a moment, warm under the blankets, listening. Your spouse is already awake, moving quietly to avoid waking the children. You hear the scrape of the stove door opening, the rustle of kindling being placed inside. You get up, pulling on your work clothes, clothes that are never quite dry at this time of year, never quite clean, always carrying the smell of coal smoke and canal water. The cabin is dark, except for the small flame catching in the stove. You light the lamp. Soft yellow light fills the small space. Your spouse puts the kettle on for tea. You step outside into the grey dawn. The rain is light, more mist than rain. The horse is already awake, standing patiently by the towpath, waiting. You give it some oats. Check the harness. Run your hand along its neck. Good horse. Reliable horse. By the time you return to the cabin, tea is ready. You drink it standing up, hot and strong and sweet. Bread and dripping for breakfast. The children are stirring now. You hear a small voice, a whispered conversation. Your spouse tells them to stay in bed a little longer. It's too cold to get up yet. You finish your tea, pull on your coat and cap, and go to get the horse properly harnessed. The tow line is damp, the leather of the harness stiff with moisture. Everything is harder in the wet. But you've done this 1,000 times. Your hands know the motions. The boat starts moving, slowly. The horse leans into the harness, and the boat responds, pulling away from the bank, settling into motion. You're at the tiller, feeling the weight of the boat behind you, making the small adjustments that keep it centered in the canal. The rain continues, steady and gentle. Your coat darkens with moisture. The morning passes slowly, mile after mile. The countryside is green with spring growth, hedgerows leafing out, fields showing the first hints of crops. Birds are singing despite the rain. You pass under bridges, through quiet stretches, where the only sound is water and the steady clip of the horse's hooves. Your spouse walks with the horse for a while. Then one of the older children takes a turn, proud to be trusted with the task. Mid-morning, you reach a flight of locks. There are 4 in a row, lifting the boat up the side of a hill. It takes an hour to work through them. Your spouse goes ahead, opening and closing paddles, pushing against the heavy gates. You steer the boat in and out of each locked chamber, feeling it rise as water floods in. The children watch from the cabin doorway, staying out of the way. By noon, you're through the locks and on a flat stretch. The rain has stopped. Weak sunlight breaks through the clouds. You eat lunch, bread and cheese, cold tea from this morning's pot. The horse gets a break, standing still for 20 minutes, resting. Then you're moving again. The afternoon is quiet. You pass another boat going the opposite direction. The Mary Jane. You recognize the paintwork. You exchange brief greetings. How's the water ahead? All clear, no problems. Ta! And they're past, disappearing behind you. Later, you pass through a small village. Children playing by the water stop to watch you pass. One waves. You wave back. There's a shop by the canal, and you think about stopping to buy supplies. But you're on a tight schedule. You'll stop tomorrow, maybe in the next town. The sun is lower now. Shadows are lengthening. You're looking for a place to tie up for the night. You want somewhere with good grass for the horse, away from other boats if possible. Quieter that way? There's a spot ahead, by a small copse of trees. The bank is solid. You bring the boat in carefully, tie up securely. The horse is unharnessed, led to the grass, hobbled loosely so it can graze. You check its legs, its shoes, give it more oats. Tomorrow is another long day, and you need the horse strong. Back in the cabin, the stove has been built up, and dinner is cooking. A simple stew, potatoes and onions, and a bit of bacon simmering in a pot. The cabin is warm now, steamy with cooking smells. The children are tired, quieter than usual. One is already half asleep in a cupboard bed. You eat dinner together, crowded around the small space. The food is hot and filling. Afterward, you sit for a few minutes, too tired to do much else. Your spouse mends a shirt in the lamplight. You check tomorrow's route on a worn map. Outside, it's fully dark now. The canal is black and still. Somewhere in the distance, you hear another boat moving. The throb of a motor, a rare sound still but becoming more common. You wonder how long before you'll need a motor too. How long before horses are obsolete? But that's tomorrow's worry. Tonight, there's just this, the warm cabin, the family safe, another day's work done. You bank the stove for the night, blow out the lamp. The darkness is complete. You find your way to the bed by memory. Lie down next to your spouse. The boat rocks very gently with some movement of the water. You're tired, very tired. But it's a good tiredness. The tiredness that comes from useful work, from a day fully lived. Tomorrow you'll wake and do it all again. And the day after. And the day after that. This is the life. This is the rhythm. This is what you know. And so, with the gentle sound of water against the hull, you drift towards sleep. And that's where we'll leave our story tonight. With that family, that boat, at the end of an ordinary day. The canal boat families lived lives of quiet persistence, moving slowly through England's waterways, carrying the cargo that powered a nation's industry, raising their children in spaces no wider than a hallway, finding beauty and home in the smallest of places. Their way of life is gone now, but the canals remain, silent witnesses to all those days, all those journeys, all those families who made the water their home. If you're still awake, I hope this story has given you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. If you're already dreaming, then I hope the dreams are peaceful. Thanks for joining me on this slow journey through history. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.